If there's anybody out there who doesn't know what's going on here, I'm John Glassman. I'm the director of the Chabraja Center of Historical Studies. And I'd like to thank you all for coming, if that's the right word, to the center's inaugural event of this pandemic season. Like many of you, I'm sure I'm finding these odd circumstances not only supremely strange in a human sense, but also technologically intimidating. Thankfully, the center's superb assistant director, Elspieta Filippitu, and our equally superb graduate fellow in digital media studies, Gil Engelstein, have been laboring really hard to make this event work. Obviously, we're going to be doing things very differently this year in the Chabraja Center than our usual procedures. The worst part, of course, is that we can't feed you a delicious lunch. But we've also decided that these remote sessions will work best if we experiment with the change of formats. Today, instead of a formal lecture by our guest, we'll instead have what my terrific colleague Lina Britto calls a conversatorio, in which Professor Putnam will engage with Lina and other colleagues whom Lina will introduce in a moment. Professor Putnam is wearing two hats during her virtual visit to Evanston this week. Today, she's wearing her historian's hat, but tomorrow she's also generously agreed to share with us some of her current work on citizen activism and the 2020 political campaign in the land of Yinzers and other parts of the industrial and formerly industrial Midwest. That will be in a conversation with Peter Slevin of the Medill School. That's an event that will take place tomorrow again at 1 p.m. Looking further forward, on October 22nd, James Millward of Georgetown will be our guest for a colloquium or roundtable on a provocative piece that he's working on titled China as Polylith, a New Paradigm for Chinese History and Why We Shouldn't Say Mulan is Chinese. Millward's interlocutors that day will be our colleagues Hayden Cherry and Melissa McCauley. And the following day, on October 23rd, Professor Millward will speak about the current crisis in the Uyghur Autonomous Region of Xinjiang in a conversation with Peter Carroll. And finally, I think I'm getting them all, Elspeta. On November 19th, Erin McLaughlin of Washington University St. Louis will present on Claude Lanzmann's Shoah and its outtakes, the ethics of perpetrator representation, in a talk co-sponsored by the Holocaust Education Foundation. You're all, of course, very welcome to these events. For more information on them, you can go to the center's website, which is historicalstudies.northwestern.edu. That's historical studies, all one word, .northwestern.edu. And so I'm very happy now to hand things over to Lina Britto.
Thank you, John, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm very excited, and it's really an honor to be here for this event with Professor Lara Putnam, who's somebody in like Latin American history and in my field that is done like such a pioneering work. So it's fantastic to be here. So what I'm gonna do is introduce each one of our guests and then kind of like a little bit of the rules of engagement, and that's it. So let's begin with our special guest, Professor Lara Putnam. She's a professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. And she graduated from her PhD at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. So she's been in Pittsburgh working on so many topics because her scholarship is so diverse and creative, but like the three main fields will be Latin American history, Atlantic history, and histories of power and inequality. And in that sense, she's been teaching about the Black Atlantic, about transnational and labor history, and about gender history as well, particularly women in Latin America. I see that recently she's been doing a lot of publications on current issues, which I always love. My historians, you know, saying important things about present times. And that's what Professor Putnam has been doing for, you know, these last crazy years that we all been living through, talking about, you know, like the social movements here in the United States, electoral politics with a gender perspective. So check that work as well. What today, what we're going to be talking about is using an essay that Professor Putnam published in 2016 entitled "The Transnational and the Text Searchable, Digitized Sources and the Shadows They Cast," in which she kind of like used her experience doing transnational history to talk about the digitization of sources. And that's kind of like the basis of the conversation today. And precisely because our scope is to understand how the digitization of sources is changing the historical practice for all of us, our second guest is somebody who has been doing this work for a long time, and like doing really pioneering work as well, and that is Bernar Riley, correct? So Bernar Riley is an independent researcher, and he's been working on documentary evidence and curatorial practice. He has an amazing career, and he's done so many different projects. Right now, he is the president of the Center for Research Libraries, CRL, but he has led several initiatives throughout his years, funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the National Science Foundation, the Library of Congress, the MacArthur Foundation, and some of those projects had to do with digital collections, electronic evidence, and human rights, preserving news in a digital environment, and global collections initiatives. Right now, he's an advisor to the MacArthur Foundation initiative to preserve evidence on enforced disappearances in Mexico during the drug wars, and a Reynolds Journalism Institute study of digital asset management in the news industry. So he's been here with all his experience and expertise, talking probably about a more practical side of this discussion. And finally, both of them, Professor Putnam and Bernar Riley, are gonna be in conversation with two of our colleagues, that is Professor Paul Gillingham and Professor Lawrence Stokes. So Professor Gillingham is one of my closest colleagues because he's another Latin Americanist. He specializes in politics, culture, and violence in modern Mexico, and has published numerous articles, book chapters, and he has two fabulous books, and very soon is going to have a third one in the next winter, spring. And another very important thing that Professor Gillingham has done is to work on the digitization of very important collections of Mexican history that were kind of like forbidden to the public when the archives, the physical archives in Mexico City closed in 2015. So since then, he's been working with Northwestern University, including the Chabraja Center and the Center for Research Libraries with Bernar Riley, in this project that's called the Mexican Intelligence Digital Archives, which is a crowdsourced open access collection of documents from Mexico's two security services. And he's gonna tell us more about that. And finally, Professor Lawrence Stokes, who is a historian of modern Germany, studying particularly migration and race in German history. And she's working on a book manuscript about family reunification for foreign workers in West Germany. And precisely because she's studying like migration, her work, it's kind of like a transnational in many ways by definition. And she's gonna be here with us kind of like contributing to our understanding of digitization with a transnational history perspective, and also public history perspective, because Professor Stokes, her work It's very much about the history of capitalism and the history of gender and sexuality and public history. So thanks everybody to all our guests. And what we're going to be doing is give both Professor Putnam and Bernar Riley a couple of minutes, like 10-15 minutes to each, to kind of like make some initial remarks. And then Professor Gillingham and Stokes are going to be in conversation with them. If you have questions or comments, please use the chat. You can either chat privately with just me or Gil or Elspiera, or to everyone. That will be actually much better, so we can all see the questions or comments. And then after those initial remarks and conversation, we're gonna be working with your comments and questions and having a more open dialogue. So let's start with Professor Putnam, and welcome again.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to Jonathan and all the center leadership, and thank you to Lina for that introduction. And thank you all for being here in the midst of a semester like no other, when I'm sure your every minute is urgently needed by your students and your families and your communities. So I really appreciate your taking the time to join us in conversation here today. As Lina said, I'll just start off by sharing a few thoughts coming out of the 2016 article, The Transnational and the Text Searchable, which some of you may have had a chance to read, and sort of elaborating on my ideas there and what I see happening and what are the dilemmas that I see really facing us as historians today. That article was written 5 years ago, published 4 years ago. 4 years in today's time is like 4 decades, right? Lots of things have changed in our practice and the tools that we use and how widely those tools are used to conduct the research that we do. So it's a moving, we are trying, I guess my underlying message here is that as historians, we need to be catching up to understand how our practice and the human and intellectual infrastructure that we've built collectively over time, which is never perfect, but an evolving and necessary sort of has been a necessary and evolving approach to creating knowledge. We both have overdue work to do to catch up with the digital present, and also that digital presence is moving fast. So we have to be chasing even to stand still. And of course, it's not new that technologies of visual reproduction and of storage change over time. The typewriter was a big change in record keeping. The advent of photocopying made changes in the practice of researchers and how they could process and carry information from one place to another. So does it make sense to think of some kind of epochal shift, some crucial change happening in the last decade or so? I think there has been. I think there has been a really critical break in what we do as historians. And part of the reason that we haven't noticed it as historians is that some of the same changes have been impacting every other aspect of our lives, as more and more of our communication and our interaction with information, where we find information and what we do with it, changes. That's been true of how we communicate with each other, from sending emails to carefully curating emails to now just assuming that storage is cheap and you can save everything you've ever generated and every photograph you ever took of any child or pet you have. And you're relying on an algorithm to pull out what you need rather than spending the time to do the curating yourself that would have happened back when, and I say this as someone who has one child who's 25 and one who's 8, the number of images of each of them that I have generated of each of them, there are lots more of the 8-year-old. The number that are easily accessible because they're in an album, there are actually a lot more of the 25-year-old than of the 8-year-old, where you're more likely to see whatever I have most immediately to hand on my phone. Well, that feels like that's not something so important, but if you start thinking, when we start thinking outward and thinking about what we do as historians, which is really access information, make judgments on the basis of it about the processes that generated that information, everything changes when the ways in which information is being stored and accessed shift radically. A part of what I've emphasized in the article that you've read is how the advent of web available digitized sources, so sources that were text based and that may have been originally printed, but have been processed through optical character recognition to be imperfectly text searchable, full text searchable, has made disintermediated web-based search a critical component of what we do as historians. And I suggest that that's as true, or that it's in some ways as impactful, that we have digitized access to secondary sources. That's also, and digitized disintermediated access to secondary sources has an impact on what we do as historians, even if the only primary sources that we're looking at are actually still ones that are sitting inside of a physical archive, right? So, because what we do as historians is a dance back and forth between the secondary literature and the primary literature, right? If you think about what we write as historians, it is not the case. So in some disciplines, there's like the lit review section, and that talks about the existing scholarship. And then you move on to methods, and then you move on to your findings. And the lit review, like the things that you cited there in the first 2 pages, don't reappear throughout, because what you're describing throughout, your methods involve your data and your, implements in the lab, or your data gathering sources, or your polls, but they're not continually in dialogue with the context. Whereas for historians, it's reading primary sources in context to create a continually updated understanding of the institutions and the context that created those sources in order to evaluate their significance, and use fragmentary, fragile, imperfect sources in ways that make them more than the sum of their whole. That's what we have done as historians. And so having access to secondary sources in new kinds of ways is also really impactful. And part of what I emphasize in the article that you've read is that this is particularly important because in an analog world, in a world where we don't have disintermediated, digitized access to sources, information tends to be place-based. And the discipline of history evolved such that it has lots of great techniques that rely on the role of place-based knowledge. So there was a sort of synergistic development of information gathering, information storage by institutions like national states, large corporations, international organizations, and historians' practices developed to be really good at making use of place-based knowledge. Place-based knowledge, both in the sense of developing deep contextual awareness of multi-layered historiography, so that we could really read and make good sense of new sources. There's a sort of de facto ethnography of institutions in the past that historians create in order to use criminal records or tax records. Who would have been lying about which levels of grain production in which provinces of Russia? That's the kind of, you might want to ask a historian. If a historian studies that place and time, they probably know a lot about the institutions that generated the sources that they're working with. So place-based knowledge has always been critically a part of the modern historical profession. So the fact that in a world of disintermediated search, historians can find without knowing where to look, and therefore encounter things without knowing where they went, anything about the places in which or institutions that generated that information, that's deeply important. That's hugely impactful. And I think it's an area where we can see that we don't have guardrails in place. We need to start creating those. So I want to point to some quick thoughts about what the old intermediaries did, and what the disintermediation does to our knowledge. Who were the intermediaries that used to guide our access to knowledge? Well, there were historiographies, there were archivists who often, more routinely, people had to know in person. There was daily life in the places that we were studying, whether that was in a rural province of the same country that we were completing our PhD in, that we were from, or across a border in a different place. So there was a sort of de facto immersive ethnographic dividend for historians, again, which doesn't have to be about going from one country to a different country. It can also be about going from one place to a different place in order to research. That forced historians to have some kind of ongoing awareness and dialogue with the current day concerns of the people living out the legacy of the past that we were studying. So there was a sort of important ethical check on our work in that sense as well. Like, historians could be held accountable even without formal mechanisms for that, through the informal frictions of daily life as one navigated the spaces that had resulted from historical processes that we were interested in studying. If, to the extent that history can now be executed, not necessarily executed well, sometimes well, and perhaps sometimes not, but to the extent that history can be executed as a discipline without me having to talk to anyone who might feel like they own that history or they have a stake in that history, that also is a radical change. Meanwhile, the fact that there are multiple aspects of finding that used to have a lot of friction and that have become seemingly frictionless for historians. So finding sources finding information in an analog world required linear reading of a source and extensive reading to figure out which source you wanted to be doing a linear reading of. So historians accidentally were sort of forced to gather a lot of contextual information, whether that's the contextual information in a historiography, in secondary literature that's going to tell you which fichero, like which file cabinet to look at in the archive, or whether it's the contextual information of like, what does the entire journal article say, from which I'm going to grab one piece of information about one historical character. So you couldn't just automatically arrive at page 22. You had to read through pages 1 through 22, and maybe even then you'd gone and read pages 23 to 25, even though the only information that you knew that you needed was on page 22. Well, your ability to judge the validity and the weight of what you were finding was shaped by all the preceding pages that you had to walk through. As a result, historians developed lots of techniques for reading despite scarcity. Historians wrote a lot about absences and silences and thought carefully about reading against the grain. Historians didn't develop many good techniques for managing overabundance, right? For thinking about, for testing how significant a particular one particular finding is, because usually by the time historians found a particularly engaging piece of information, there had been an immersive reading that de facto created a sort of de facto like Sitzfleisch based, the just hours, what one of my colleagues calls horas nalga, like the hours of sitting in the archive or the hours of sitting with your sources, reading through them, played the equivalent role for historians of statistical tests of significance in more quantitative social sciences. So we don't have as many checks that push back against our eagerness to see in a particular source and to discover a connection that seems to resonate with what we're hearing in what's of interest to us in secondary debates right now, sort of topics that are trendy. We don't have built into our practice, built into our disciplinary expectations, we don't have as many checks and balances against what you might think of as confirmation bias, right? So, which doesn't mean that we can't build those back in, we can, but it involves, again, intentional labor to do that, intentional collective labor. And I'll conclude, because I'm sure I'm almost at or over time here, by jumping ahead, by talking about a few ways in which our practice as historians, they're new. It's not just about the old things that we used to do that we're doing in new ways. There are entirely new questions are opened up by the fact both that we're doing research within a digital sea of information, and by the fact that we're publishing into a digital world in which other people are reading us through practices of disintermediated search. So what we're publishing is at risk of being read in ways that are decontextualized, in ways that wouldn't have been the case before. That opens up new possibilities of public outreach. That's great. It also opens up new risks that we need to be taking on board and thinking through as ethical dilemmas. So one dimension of this is to think about our research practice. How far the idea 5 decades ago when I was in graduate school, the idea that one had an ethical obligation to try to find people in the sources and make them visible and make their voices heard seemed, transparent, unproblematic. Today, I think we need to think, because our ability to find people has been so radically amped up, so we now have access, smooth, rapid, quick access to many more of the individually identifiable fruits of the surveillance states that have existed across the last 200 years or so, means that the idea that there's some simple goal of giving voice to the voiceless or making people visible should have some big red blinking lights there. So how far do we go with that? If we're trying to track people, do we look and see whether they have grandkids who we could go talk to? Because that's not really easy. Should we be looking for people on Facebook and asking them questions about people who we're finding in our sources? Well, what's to stop us? If our goal is find all information out about our historical subjects, sure. And if there's a reason that makes us uneasy, like for instance, the person who's there on Facebook may not know that about their grandparent, may not have asked for us to tell them about their grandparent, may not be prepared for what we are finding out about their grandparent. What are the ethical rules that we think should be guiding our practice as historians in terms of the research that we're doing and our research subjects and our the descendants and connections of our research subjects? So there are a whole bunch of questions that fall into the realm which human subjects guidelines, ethical guidelines for human subjects research has dealt with in other disciplines that we have not thought were our problem, where really the reason that they've been less our problem had to do with these technical limits on the knowability and the findability of connections, and those technical limits have disappeared. And now we need to think about what ethical limits we want to build back in. And there are also so that sort of is thinking about the research practice side, but there's also the publication side, right? So publishing in a world of disintermediated digital search is radically different from publishing and what counts as public and the implications of being public are radically different in the current world. And we see this, for instance, in the fact that some newspapers that used to routinely publish in their physical newspapers mugshots from arrests have moved in recent years to stop doing that, because it is completely different for a small town paper to publish mugshots that will circulate for one weekend in physical form, end up in a single library, and used under canary trays in some people's houses, and not be de facto acceptable. So that photo was published, but its period of findability and its geographic range of findability was really constrained, and constrained to people with a certain ethical commitment, which could be problematic, but constrained to people with some stakes within that same community, right? But in a world of digital publication, something that we put out there is no longer constrainable and can be replicated, can be taken out of context, can be so that the problems that some digital theorists refer to as context collapse, in which when I tweeted X, it was clear that I was being sarcastic, but you take that quote out of context and I lose my job. So that there are similar sort of parallel issues raised by what we publish as historians. And I'll give you just one example that may seem unimportant, but I think isn't. When I wrote my first book, I was working with judicial records, and I decided, including some around sexual violence, I decided it would be important to use pseudonyms for the people for the subjects of the cases, even though I was working with cases from 100 years ago, probably no one was identifiable in the present. It seemed like the right thing to do. So, but in the current moment, is using pseudonyms within our work, is that really a safeguard, or we're creating a name? The footnote in which I say that's a pseudonym, it's not a real person, is probably 17 pages back. That page with that person's name and an assertion about a sexual crime or etc. is now findable, and it's findable without any thing that would guide someone to have read the footnote in which I say that was a pseudonym first. So one is actually if we're creating historical declarations about people, I think using pseudonyms is no longer an appropriate measure. So as opposed to using, numbers, using initials, using codes. So using something so that the context, which says this is not a real person's name, can't be taken away from the assertion that you're making. What all this says is that historians need an urgent and fast engagement with a whole bunch of other fields, like oral history, like conflict studies, like ethnographic disciplines that do ethnographic field work, public health ethics, so the body of knowledge that's been generated and discussion that's been generated around, for instance, incidental findings with genetic testing. All of these are disciplines where the idea of what should we do with information that we find, and who are the human subjects who have stakes, who have appropriate ethical stakes in what we do with the information that we find. they're all much further along in thinking through these issues, and we need to collectively, because this is not something, it's not like sort of right now what we're doing essentially, I think as a historical profession, is doing sort of the equivalent of like Uber. We're pushing all of the risk of, there are all these new technologies, there's work that needs to be done, rather than doing it collectively and deliberately and through institutional processes. We're just outsourcing this to graduate students and young people coming up through the discipline in informal status, with less secure employment status, who are being asked to make decisions about their research practice under conditions, to begin with, of constraint and anxiety and so on, without really clear guidance from any disciplinary bodies or coming out of any collective deliberations about what we should and shouldn't be doing, for what are we aiming for together, what are best practices for history in a digital age. So I would love for us all to begin those questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So much food for thought. I've been taking notes furiously. So if you want to share some of your thoughts or comments or whatever, Gail, Elspieta, and myself are kind of curating here the chat. So just use the chat and we will go through that. So next is Bernar Riley. So welcome, Bernie, and go ahead.
Thank you. I'll start by reassuring you that I'm not as pink as I appear on the screen. I understand that my camera and my computer on my laptop is reacting to the green wall behind me. It's adjusting for that. So I thought, since I'm the oldest person on the screen, some of you may have been alarmed by the coloring, but thanks for the opportunity to comment and to participate. My perspective, as Lina said, draws upon a long curatorial career. Work primarily ensuring survival and integrity of archives and news content and government information, and more recent work on digital evidence for human rights and anti-corruption efforts. These are, as Lara's, as Professor Putnam's articles suggest, these are extremely exciting times for historians, with this vast broadening of access to content to support transnational place-based studies. I was particularly taken with the concept of the pricing of the information landscape for transnational research, and the discussion, Professor Putnam's discussion of the how time and distance create frictions that have shaped and in many ways limited how history is written. My main focus has been with the primary sources that Laura talks about, and to a large extent, as Professor Putnam says, the information landscape for historians has been in primary sources consisted largely of what bricks and mortar institutions like libraries, archives, and museums can deliver. Physical evidence, essentially, newspapers, paper records, maps, audio recordings, films, those kinds of things, and increasingly digitized copies of those kinds of materials. Those are what those institutions can and do and have for centuries really delivered. As Professor Putnam says, the densely knit transnational systems could be studied pre-internets, and were, but peripheral vision was prohibitively expensive. Web-based digital search repriced this information landscape. I think Professor Putnam's way of looking at the pricing of information access and the notions of cost and frictions applies very well to the realm of evidence that is born digital or digital only, or as people in the newsroom say, digital first. Here we're looking at a fundamentally different supply chain, it seems to me, though, an infrastructure for the delivery of evidence and data relevant to the historical record that challenges the bricks and mortar, the memory apparatus that's long supported historical research and inquiry. This is another epochal break. Specifically, what I've seen in the last 10, 15 years is the growing privatization or capitalization of information, that this phenomena has enormous implications for both the time, monetary, and the social costs of transnational research. And so I'll just talk a little bit about that. technology has enabled, it's not caused, but it's enabled the transfer of the custodial functions from community-based memory institutions to the corporate sector to a large extent, and given vast curatorial power to the commercial sector, it seems to me. The bricks and mortar institutions, the usual intermediaries, are increasingly being replaced by large information behemoths like Google, Amazon, Facebook, and those. Bloomberg, I'm going to share my screen here, and I will see if this works. Whoops, wrong one. Can you see the Bloomberg screen? Okay, great. Yeah, Bloomberg really is the case study here. As Google and Facebook and the social media and YouTube were developing very spectacularly and openly, Bloomberg was a big story that the memory institution world, I think, missed. That's the ability of an individual like Michael Bloomberg to turn what was essentially information kept on little sheets of paper by bonds traders and by stock traders into a technology information enterprise that not only includes online access to data, but a global broadcast network that has enormous implications for the way information and even documentation and evidence is traded, it seems to me. The speed at which information moves, the volume of information that's traded day after day, and the scope, the global intelligence that's now within the grasp of most people through a computer is unprecedented, and it's also the reason why the finance industry in particular is driving a lot of the shaping the information landscape to a large extent these days. A couple of, let me see, I should do this on this as a slideshow. Yeah, okay, less distracting. A couple of examples from relatively recent times. This is the satellite photographs of a satellite photograph of North Korea, pinpointing some of the nuclear installations. And this became widely traded a couple years ago as the West became alarmed by the further development, the continued development of nuclear technology, particularly nuclear defense technology in North Korea. 30 years ago, this photograph would have been taken by a spy satellite that was operated by the U.S. intelligence or the U.S. Defense Department. Today, these photographs, some of the most valuable photographs of nuclear developments in North Korea, are being captured by a commercial firm based in Southern California, Digital Globe. Digital Globe has become indispensable to not only the intelligence community, but also to the public policy research community and to the news media. Syria, the Syrian Archive is an NGO, a activist organization that documents the events in Syria during the conflict there. What they've been a particularly important part of the evidence that Syrian Archive has made available are videos, and these videos are hosted by YouTube. This is just a picture, a screenshot of their documentation and their data web page. This is all open source information. The videos document from the standpoint of media people or from the standpoint of individual observers, things like the bombing of hospitals and the other atrocities and other violations of human rights in Syria during the conflict. Literally tens of thousands of those videos sit on YouTube. A couple of years ago, YouTube changed its algorithm for the algorithm they use to automatically remove content that's found to be objectionable to a large extent, content that they find to be violent or overly violent from the YouTube interface. overnight hundreds of videos that the Syrian archive had collected and posted on YouTube for purposes of eventually using as evidence in prosecutions after the war, or even in providing visual record of the war, disappeared. This was the changes in the algorithm was something that Google, the YouTube people, did on their own and without notification. So it's an example of a major platform that's used by a lot of human rights organizations for the storage and the dissemination of important primary evidence, how non-transparent that platform, the operations of that platform actually are in a consequential way. Facebook, a couple of years ago in 2017, the Myanmar government and the police and military launched a campaign of propaganda and incitement to violence of people against the Rohingya Muslim minority. Facebook was the platform of choice for the military and the Myanmar officials. And Facebook is, as people have said, is in Myanmar is pretty much synonymous with the internet. It's the major source of information for people. Those postings were, once Facebook figured out what was happening with their platform and how it was being used, they removed those postings. The problem is, it's great that they were removed from public view. The problem is Facebook has refused to disclose those for purposes of UN investigation of the genocide. So again, you have a corporate repository which doesn't abide by the same rules of transparency and disclosure as the repositories that we're used to in the bricks and mortar world. I'll get back to the pink man. All right. This is the shift of curatorial responsibility to the corporate sector is actually quite pervasive. These are just a couple instances of it. One part that's one phenomenon that's it's been pervasive in Latin America is the use of a geospatial data platform developed and controlled and licensed by a corporation, a tech corporation based in Redwood City, California. Esri's ArcGIS geospatial platform has really become basic infrastructure for a number of Latin American governments where they keep, store, and make available, they use the platform to store and make available information regarding everything from water supply to power supply to environmental conditions and weather conditions. And so that's, again, another example of the kind of way that a lot of important data and documentation is being shifted to essentially private sector providers. There was a 2018 report by the Social Science Research Council that raised the alarm for social scientists. The report was called "To Secure Knowledge: Social Science Partnerships for the Common Good." That report said, quote, "Several decades ago, much of the world's social science data was generated by universities, government agencies, or international organizations. Today, information technologies have caused an exponential increase in the quantity of socially relevant data." You could read historically relevant data, much of which has become the intellectual property of companies. Most dramatically, private industry has destabilized the social knowledge system. So putting much of this evidence in control of news organizations, commercial organizations, and putting it on third-party platforms that are often either unstable or proprietary does have implications for the costs and the pricing of place-based information, of particularly transnational data, since it is global trends that are driving this kind of thing. So I hope that this is useful in the discussion. It's relevant to the discussion that we'll have today, and I appreciate having the time to share a few thoughts.
Thank you so much. So now let's move to the comments. from Professor Gillingham and Stokes. So I don't know if you guys kind of like decided who's gonna go first, or like we just, okay. So let's do, I don't know, let's start with Professor Stokes, and then we move to Professor Gillingham. And we still taking comments and questions from all of you guys here in the chat.
Great. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you. I'm a German historian, as was mentioned, and I work transnationally and across 4 or 5 different languages. So most German archives have converted their finding aids to the digital with the help of a search engine called Faust. So I think I've always had a very deep sense that digitization is in fact a pact with the devil that I have like imbibed in my own work. I'm very suspicious of it, and I think that comes from a kind of German training that I have. A lot of archivists in Germany play a very strong role in kind of screening what you can see. I've done some work now in the East German security archives where you are not allowed to look at finding aids. You are only allowed to talk to an archivist who will then bring you what they believe is necessary for your context. And oral history collections I've worked with have never been transcribed. I've always had to ask for recordings to listen to, and that's a privacy concern. And my notes have also been frequently checked to make sure that I actually am using pseudonyms and codes and not real person's names. And that is a condition of my access to the archive. So I'm perhaps the person who defended my PhD very recently, but with no digital photographs for the entire dissertation and book manuscript, and very few photocopies. So I found but I realized as I was reading your article that I have made massive use of what you call disintermediated search. And so I will just ask one question, and then I really want to hear from graduate students who are kind of embarking on another 6 months of a life of disintermediated search. I really want to hear their questions. But one thing I thought about a lot when I was reading your article and in my own practice is the challenges of multilingualism. So the way that we test languages is, can you translate an article using a dictionary in a few hours? And I can do that in several of my research languages, but the kind of iterative contextual knowledge that it requires to do good Google searching is something I really only have in a few of my research languages. And I never know how honest to be about that, right? And this has gotten me in trouble at certain times. There was a very long time when I thought one of my main archives had no work on my topic because I had never typed the word in the genitive case. And so I now have kind of my own knowledge of how I do searches in these other languages, but it's been built up over a decade at this point. And I'm very aware that my ability to search is different in my different research languages. And I know you also work multilingually, and I'm curious what your thoughts are about that and how people who work across multiple languages can think about our different levels of facility with it. Right, and this is compounded, of course, by the fact that there's more Anglophone stuff on the web. There's more Germanophone stuff on the web, in my case, than Turkish stuff on the web. But that is compounded by my enhanced ability in my mother tongue and so on. So that's one question I have. I guess my other question about privacy is, I was curious to hear how you had thought about that in your first book, and how are you thinking about that today, and how has kind of thinking about this changed how you train graduate students, I guess would be one question I had, because I really don't feel like there was any training in terms of disintermediated search when I was coming up. And I'm wondering kind of how your deep thinking about this has changed your own practice, and what messages you have to people who are embarking on COVID constrained dissertation research, let's call it. Thank you.
So why don't we go with the answers right away, and then we go to Professor Gillingham and try to do this more like a dialogue and a conversation. So go ahead.
Yeah, so first, I guess just a few quick thoughts. It's so interesting to think about questions of translation, in part because I think it helps us surface some of our arbitrary assumptions about which kinds of technical aids, like which algorithms is it fine to make ill-informed use of, and which algorithms is it not okay to make ill-informed use of. So, you know, at this point, is that you weren't asking about this, but Google Translate is like a reasonably solid, offers, you know, reasonably solid translations for vastly expanding and reasonably solid already, and like exponentially improving translations. But none of us, I think very few people doing graduate training in history are saying, oh, well, just go, you know, just grab that source and drop it into Google Translate and use it. Like that would feel like, oh my God, that's so, how could you send someone to just grab a source? I mean, you know, maybe occasionally for a quick look and then check it with an expert, you know, to see if, like, if it's the one document in another language that you think could be relevant, do a quick check through Google Translate, and then like go do your homework, find someone who knows that language, work with them. And yet sort of we're relying on algorithms all the time. So in some sense, the notion of disintermediated search, really what we're saying is that we've gone from a plethora of visible mediators who we have some access to and know something about, to a whole bunch of invisible to us intermediaries, right? Which are the algorithms, which are the platforms that are massively shaping what we can see, what we can find, what we can't find, and therefore what we should do with it. And we're just like, go run in traffic, no problem, go use those algorithms. So why is that? What truth about our concerns is captured by the fact that we think you need to know, you need prior training and depth of contextual knowledge to work across languages that can't simply be substituted by the Google Translate box, but somehow we don't assume that you need that same kind of depth of prior training to work across spaces and to make sense of documents in a language that may be generated in a language that you know, but in a context that you don't know. So what do we need to bring up? Do we need to spend less time on language training? Maybe is it the case that now we want to do heresy, less language training or less intensive language training, but more training on basic courses in platform capitalism, and what are the legal, economic, ethical and technical structures shaping the digital platforms that we work with? How do we rebalance this? And your question about privacy as well is I think equally one where we need to sort of push to the front, make visible and intentional are two things. How are we functioning as gatekeepers? And your reference to, some of the reasons that I think it's going to be, historians who work in conflict situations, who've worked with genocide studies, testimonials, actually are further along in some of these thinking, because it's so clear that the stakes are high. And so the kinds of training that you, like, do not photograph, some of the kinds of training that you have already taken on board, actually, we probably need to spread outward to a broader range of practitioners, because, it's like those are the protocols that have been developed within certain fields, because it's clear that the stakes are extraordinarily high, but actually with somewhat less intensity and, assurance, the stakes for individuals are pretty high now in a lot of different things that we're doing. So some of these questions around testimony, the visibility of testimony, the findability of testimony, now we need to sort of pull those outward. I had the same thought as I was listening to Bernar Riley, your comments about the role of platforms in preserving or shaping access to human rights data. It's really critical, but also it also actually impacts a much broader range of information, not only this critical human rights data. and traces and testimonies. So let's take advantage of the really important work that and thinking which is going on there and spread it more broadly, so that we can all benefit from that.
So before we go to Paul Gillingham, I wonder if Bernie wants to add something about, research in multiple languages and translations.
Not much I can add. I will echo Professor Putnam saying that the evidence, the critical evidence, the sensitive evidence there's sensitive evidence relating not well beyond the realm of human rights. There's a lot of important work being done by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the people that broke the Panama Papers, and well, back to WikiLeaks. I think the relationship of governments to public archives is gotten a bit more challenging. I mean, there was always tampering with public archives. They were always politicized. But I think now with the emphasis since 9/11 on secrecy and the relative lack of transparency, encroaching lack of transparency in Western governments, even that the role of the archives becomes a much more problematic thing, and something that you have to question a bit more than you ever did before.
All right, thank you. Okay, so let's go to Paul Gillingham and your comments or questions.
Right, I'll be extremely brief, at least I hope. Aided in part by Lara's extremely comprehensive article, which I actually found deeply irritating because every time I thought I had a question, it turned out 5 pages later it was actually tackled quite neatly. And so in a minute, I'd like to ask 2 nuts and bolts questions, one of Lara, one of Bernar, which I think have sort of methodological, maybe even philosophical import, but I'd like to talk really in nuts and bolts terms. First, just as a matter of a thank you both to Bernie and to Chabraja, I'm going to screen share this, which is an archive which Lina referred to briefly. So I found it in 2015. It was in part politically oriented because of the censorship of these agencies. It was done with funding from really across the university. Chabraja played an important part. Thank you, Sarah. And hosted at the CRL by Bernie, without which this would not be at all possible. So there it is. It's got 7 metadata labels on each document. So it's not reliant just on text search. We're hoping it's quite a sensitive interface. And it's got a lot of use, but therein, very briefly, half of the problem, in that it's not just that this was expensive. Getting specialists to read a document, put on 7 metadata labels, costs a lot of money. And what that meant was that Lara's problems that she identified of the selectivity of these archives was really magnified in Midas, because it was extremely selective in terms of the period it covered. It focused overwhelmingly on the late 60s and early 70s set of human rights abuses. And in this narrow group of people who fundamentally I chose based on what was available. And what was available was what other people had found interesting, photocopied and donated. So you have an archive which in some ways, it worked politically briefly. The government said it was going to open the archives, then didn't, but it sounded good for a minute. It gives us access we wouldn't have anyway across the board. It's open access, but it's a warped track into history. I rather appreciate some pretty basic digital tools, which I think it's overlooked sometimes how useful digital tools can be from the pretty local and the regional. We talked a lot, and we will talk about the transnational, but for me, if I can't go to a town or village, which I'm going to talk about, then be able to go there on Google Earth and see, oh, wow, there's a ravine there, there's a river there. Gives me a sense of place, which otherwise I would not have got, because you cannot visit every village in Mexico. It's not going to happen, or Colombia, or anywhere else, not even East Germany. Secondly, things like Ancestry.com help me in clientelist societies. This is all really basic stuff along the level of JSTOR. So those are the sort of sunny upsides. The downside, everything Lara pointed to, and above all, the sort of deracinated history that this is producing. Superficially deep, but in the end, really deeply superficial. They sort of pick and mix a few terms across a lot of places, which looks good, but is profoundly deracinated, and as such, profoundly problematic. And so my question for Lara is, you were talking about guardrails, about checks and balances for this sort of history. You talked eloquently in the article about the pressure to produce it, the professional pressure to be a global, transnational historian. But what sort of checks and balances or guardrails to all the losses you identified can we think of? I thought immediately write less articles, strategic article reduction treaty, and spend more time on peer review, so that when I send in an article or a book, instead of 2 people, I've got 7. And one knows about Germany, one knows about Colombia, one knows about archives, one knows about Mexico. A set of checks and balances, which would mean that my manuscript would either work or else be sent back over and over again. And to apply the same far more labor-intensive approach to dissertation exams. All this means, to stay sane, I spend less time writing articles no one reads. Well, that helps also with problems of data flood, right? So my question to you, Lara, is guardrails, checks and balances. What can we think in nuts and bolts terms of doing? And then to Bernie, this critical question. I mean, I also found your presentation irritating because it made me dislike Facebook even more. And I didn't really need that. Life's depressing enough already. This was an excellent example of how we are really losing control of critical information and looking sort of to historians of the future. I really appreciated that. What could be done in concrete terms to push back against the privatization and the monetization of really basic archival knowledge for the future? And on that, thanks very much.
Yeah, go ahead, Lara.
Sure. So I really appreciate your intervention and your call for concrete terms of you know, where are the checks and balances. I'm reminded again of, not coincidentally, of the example or the parallel of Uber, right? Like, is it that Uber makes all this money because they're actually vastly more efficient in doing the thing that used to be done, you know, moving people around? Are they vastly more efficient than taxis? Well, people have argued really persuasively that actually what they're doing is regulatory arbitrage, right? They're finding ways of getting out of rules. So it's the digital is actually, and digital information flows and micro matching of service providers and those desiring services are actually allowing you know, corporations to providing services to go around rules that we put in place for a reason, right? So, and to me, there's a parallel here to how we're continue to use, for instance, footnotes, the apparatus of citation, in ways that don't actually represent what we're doing now. And so here's the thought experiment. If historians had to actually write totally honest footnotes, like if you had to put into your footnotes exactly what you actually did to find each thing, rather than, because basically what we're doing is we're creating our apparatus of citation pretends that, or it does not speak about, and therefore by omission allows misapprehension of what we've actually done, right? So it suggests in really important studies by Ian Milligan and others, they've shown that in fact you can trace the massive impact of source digitization. It's very clear that when, for instance, newspapers become digitized, their level of citation, rises by an order of magnitude, but only in a vanishingly small number of cases do people put into their footnotes that they're using the digitized source of the form of the newspaper. So you could say, oh, but like there was a limit there was a page limit, I couldn't have included that information, I'm so sorry, it was no, but implicitly what we're doing is asserting that we followed a traditional practice of analog reading and search to find these things, and there's a sort of prestige and reliance on that as an authoritative rendering of the source, because it suggests that we read the whole thing, some big chunk of the whole thing, when maybe we just searched for a term and read a single paragraph. So if historians had to accurately say, here's how much of this source I read, and here's the form that I read it in, and here's how I found it, I think there would be a readjustment of our practice as historians. That would sort of move in the directions that you're provocatively calling us for. We would have less time to do stuff, and also we would get, articles that look really classy and definitive would suddenly look, maybe would look weaker, a little more raquíticos. And maybe that would send us back to the archives to do more, or even it would send us to the database to do more reading if I had to actually read the whole article before asserting that I can cite this article. Sort of similarly with archival, presence, when graduate students are proposing, well, in the pre-coronavirus era, proposing, describing their research trip and glowing letters of recommendation, say, well, Paul conducted multi-archival research across Mexico. Well, how long did Paul spend? Probably in this case, you spent a lot of time there. But if we're, in a world in which increasingly, and again, it actually will be interesting to see how coronavirus changes this, because now there can't be a presumption that people, who have a PhD that was researched in the year 2020 spent long immersive stretches within any research site other than their own living room. So, I'm not saying that, that needs to be okay, but we also need to be upfront about the practices that we're following. And we need to decide what are our standards for surrounding knowledge and contextual knowledge, and push ourselves to create new expectations for ourselves and others.
I like the revolutionary idea of honest footnotes.
I do too, and it strikes me that there's another parallel to like the Uberization of things, which is that we expect innovation and disruption from every single project now, and that can kind of create the temptation to be less contextual in the way we think about it, and to make it seem as if I'm the first person to have done all of these things, and to erase both the work of those who came before and the work that actually is the reproductive work of putting the archive together. But this would require some kind of like code of ethics. I think it would be great if the AHA was working on a code of ethics about how we talk about our information gathering. Because yes, I'm thinking about my own footnotes, and yeah, not all of them are that honest.
Or the revolutionary idea also of, if you had a different level of dissertation exam, of peer review, then the attention to older histories, which Lara calls for an article, would be mandatory. One would have to have read books from 30 years ago by Cronista del Pueblo to actually get through a dissertation exam. Because if not, why not? All right, you got one issue, one article from one newspaper. Why didn't you read this classic of the 50s, which is the baseline for so much of which came afterwards?
So I wonder if Bernie has any comment from like the archivist point of view about these practices and ethical codes.
Yeah, Paul asked, how do we push back on this privatization of information and this monetization of the information landscape? And I think it's huge scale that's working in the favor of the large information hosts and the cloud services and the providers, whether it's Google Books or Facebook or Amazon, and that's going to be a challenge. But I think some of this will play out in the courts. There are in the International Criminal Court and a number of federal courts, there are cases now where the obligations of large data providers for disclosure of information for purposes of court cases, for purposes of establishing the facts in whether it's a human rights case or whether it's a case, a commercial, litigation in the U.S. Telecommunications providers are the ones that are mostly on the hot seat with regard to providing information on contents of phone calls and metadata on phone calls. But the Facebook is now on the hot seat, and I think more and more you're going to see requests or pressure for more disclosure from those organizations, pressure from the public realm, like the courts. But the second thing is audit. There's the real problem is the lack of transparency of how these platforms work, what Google decides to show you when you do a search, what comes up on your Facebook news feed, that kind of thing. And the intermediaries now are the algorithms, essentially. They're the ones who will be keeping Lauren from national security related information or personalized information in the future. And they have biases built into them that are, for the most right now, they're pretty much undetectable. There are some cases where the case of Facebook and the Russian tampering with the election, there's been a fair amount more disclosure of how Facebook algorithms work. But the biases are very, very, very dark mechanisms, and they're very difficult to understand. And the companies have an incentive to keep them secret, to keep them dark, because these are trade secrets. This is competitive intelligence, how a particular algorithm works. It really has to do with the bottom line of the corporation. And the proprietary platforms that are used, are basically, there should be much more public disclosure about those, it seems. But to be able to get that kind of leverage, to get leverage with those organizations to disclose the biases and to just be more transparent about how the platforms work. The courts have some leverage, but I think the academy has some leverage as well. The academy spends a lot of money with Elsevier and Springer and Reilly and LexisNexis and those right now in the information market, but it's not terribly smart. They're not using that leverage in a very, very smart way. Most of the discourse is about price, and price is important, especially under austerity. But what's equally important, if not more important, is transparency. And right now, most of the licensing arguments, negotiations that are being held by libraries and by consortia with the information providers are really about price and really about and also about intellectual property to a lesser extent, but mostly about price, and that needs to change. I think the academy lost control of a lot of scholarly publishing decades ago by shortchanging the homegrown apparatus, namely the university presses, and so a lot of the information went elsewhere. But I think those are the main things. It's a very, the information industry has become really, it was always anchored in the commercial sector, but it's become a lot less transparent in recent years.
Thank you. So we have great questions here in the chat, and they've been sent to everyone, so all of you can read it. I see that at least two of them are very specific about these practices, the effects of this change in archival practices. That will be Ruby Daly's question, and the other one is the effects of this on publication and dissemination practices, and that's from Amy Stanley. So why don't we start with you, Ruby, just very briefly, kind of presenting your questions to everybody, and then we go to Amy.
Sure. Can everyone hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great. Hi, my name is Ruby Daly. I'm a grad student I was recently paid by one of the big archival digitization services that work with our libraries, and they were creating a new collection about sexuality. And one of the collections they were digitizing was one that I had worked with and that I recently published an article about. And so they asked me to write a guide on it. And they gave me back-end access to it before they published it. And this particular archive that I was most familiar with were letters sent to a public figure. And I realized that they had removed so much information from these letters that I could have never written my article ever in the form that it came to take with all of this information gone. The gender, the names, the location, even the dates a lot of the times. I don't really know how those letters would be particularly useful to historians, but I could have a bent mind from having used them in the archive and made my own choices about what to hold back. And then the second part of that is that I realized that from my own notes, there were many, many things missing from this online digital archive that I knew existed in the archive. I knew these letters existed. I had notes and pictures of them, and they were nowhere to be found, even though the claim was that this was an 100% digitized collection. And so my question was kind of in a more metaphorical sense about things getting lost in the shuffle, I guess, and what that means. Yeah, so that's pretty much it.
Why don't we go to Amy? Thank you, Ruby. Why don't we go to Amy Stanley as well? Because it also has to do with like the effects of this, but on the other side, like publication and dissemination practices.
Yes, so Professor Putnam and I were actually on a panel about this a few years ago, and I've really been thinking about it ever since I wrote my own book on a very obscure person who I suddenly made hyper visible, and trying to think about, you know, what is my responsibility to what Professor Putnam, I think, called the stakeholders, right, in that history. But it really made me think about, okay, so if we're trying to think about who the stakeholders in that history are today, are a kind of automatic assumptions like, well, it's okay, it's the family, it's the descendants, it's the village. But how do we then kind of avoid recapitulating these structures that might have been very oppressive in that individual's life, right? And that she might have wanted herself to escape, that she might have been rebelling against, or that we as historians might be writing against, and particularly I think of patriarchy, right? So if we are making the judgment that, okay, we're going to shield names when we're talking about sexual assaults that happened 100 years ago, but not necessarily when we're talking about theft or murder, is that a kind of our imposing our judgment about what is knowable and what is not knowable in a way that's actually substituting for the judgment of the historical figure? How do we kind of untangle that?
So I'm going to ask you just to be brief because we only had 10 minutes, so we'll see like how far we can go. Thanks.
Sure. So I mean, these are both super case studies to bring forward, right? And I think to me what they emphasize is the need for something like a working group on transparency, privacy, and accountability for historians in a digital age, because we can't, and I mean, Bernie is importantly talking about there's so much that historians can't control, but if we at least, but there are parts of our own practice as professionals that we can control by deliberating, by thinking about, what has changed and how issues of information transparency and the importance of making visible curatorial processes, what's been left out and why in information as it's presented. If we can develop a thoughtful set of questions, like not answers, questions that should be getting asked, then I think we're also, and if we do that in dialogue, again, with other disciplines, in dialogue with archivists who have a whole set of conversations underway about critical archival practice that are super relevant and that not enough historians are reading, we would then be in a better position both to answer these questions for ourselves, but also to be interlocutors for, so if we have a code of conduct for ourselves, that puts us in a better position to say to a private company putting together a set of digital sources, well, here's why that won't work for us, or here's what needs to go along with that. So thinking collectively about that will, I think, be really important. I can't see any way for us forward without a sort of collective process, and probably, the AHA has had some internal conversations in the past that partially overlap with this. And the AHR is, so for the American Historical Review, I'm now the, Lord even knows what, contributing something for a new section on history in a digital age. And the first articles there are just beginning to come out, and we're trying to publish more pieces that speak directly to some of these issues. And I'll put in a plug for a podcast that's coming out like next month with a scholar named Ari Joskowitz, who works on archives of sort of post testimonials from the Holocaust. And I did a podcast interview with him. He has an AHR piece coming out that deals with some of these questions of testimony and sources being taken out of context and published in new ways. So hopefully these conversations will move forward informally, but also I think we need some formal spaces for deliberation as well.
And I'll go ahead, Bernie. Yep.
I was going to say, in terms of the leverage that historians have, I think you have an enormous amount of leverage with two big organizations that have been players, were players in the past, the National Archives and Records Administration and the Library of Congress. These are two organizations that have made disastrous investments in digital preservation in the last 20 years. And I think those investments were disastrous because they had not been guided by historians and even though there are existing advisory groups that do advise or provide input, those groups have really not been used very well. So I think there's a great deal of potential leverage.
Thank you. So there are other questions here. One from Helen Tilley, who had to leave, saying that kind of like microfilm in many ways open up these issues in an earlier era. And then she gave us some examples and talks also about records that are going missing. But I think kind of like the best question kind of like to conclude will be from Kate Mazer. So Kate, if you want to just pose the question to everybody, if you're still here. Okay, I think she left. Okay, so the question is, I'm wondering what historical professional associations, particularly the AHA, have been doing, if anything, to address these problems. So I don't know if you, Lara, has any answer about this, or anybody else knows what is the conversation at the level of the AHA?
So I've been part of a few conversations at the AHA that have begun to grapple with these questions. I think there's been so there are no perfect answers for any of these questions, and I think moving past the point of saying I was, for instance, a part of one conversation about digital publishing in which folks who were coming from doing very cutting edge digital work were appropriately focused on making sure that there would be, journals that would capture the, multiple affordances of digital projects that are, underway, so that one is not only able to produce new digital tools as a historian that can only be accredited through peer review if they are in textual form, right? So there are a set of questions around how do we support digital work as historians that are distinct from but partially overlapping with this. And the AHA actually did do, I think, an important job of pulling people in the room to create guidelines for evaluating digital work. If in your departments you have folks who've done important who've done different kinds of digital history as part of their research production, hopefully you've been attuned to those guidelines, and hopefully those have been shaping your evaluation process, tenuring processes. So maybe we can think of that as being a first layer of infrastructural work to make sure that we could have an appropriately wide range of people in the room to be having the next stage of conversations that we need to have, which are not just about digital tools of digital historians, but are about digital tools and affordances as they impact everybody. But folks who do digital, who think of themselves as doing digital history, have been carrying some of these conversations forward already. So now I think we're at a stage where some of the really basic broadening of the profession to be at least a little more welcoming of and sustaining of people intentionally engaging with digital tools should make it possible for us to move forward these sort of even broader conversations. And you know, we're all stuck at home for the next year or so, so maybe that's a good chance for people to spend less time in airports and more time on bylaws, on, you know, drafting committees.
So thank you so much. Unfortunately, our time is up. We only have until 2:30, so we have to say goodbye. And one of the downsides of this digital era is that we cannot stick around and like have a lunch and continue the conversation over food and drinks. So I don't really know how can we address all these wonderful questions that are going to stay here in the chat waiting for an answer. But thanks everybody. And I don't know if John or Spiera or Paul or Lauren or Bernie or anybody has anything else that they want to add.
Just to thank everybody involved, this unusually large cast we had. Thanks very much. And thank Lina and Bernie and Lauren and Paul, as well as Professor Putnam. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you everybody and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.